three authors, historians with us today to provide some thoughts on the Confederate commander in this campaign. What we're going to do is each of the authors will have about 5 minutes to make a brief statement in general about Braxton Bragg or some aspect of the general. And then I'll start out posing a couple of questions, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you all. And we'll see if we can't, as we approach high noon, have a few additional insights into to this key player. Joining us today is Dr. Earl Hess from Lincoln Memorial University, and many of you all know that Dr. Hess is the author of many books, including ones that are available today in the bookstore, a volume on the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, another Atlanta campaign engagement, Ezra Church, and also his well-received volume on Civil War tactics, which won the Tom Watson Brown Prize from the Society of Civil War Historians in 2016. And of course, most specifically for our discussion today, his look at Braxton Bragg, the most hated man of the Confederacy. So we'll get Dr. Hess's thoughts about General Bragg over the next few minutes. In the center is David Powell. David is now very much a historian of the campaign for Chattanooga, and started out with his Maps of Chickamauga volume, which I know that some of you all have probably got 2 copies of. One copy you keep on the shelf at home, nice and neat, and the other copy you carry out into the field with you, and has gotten rained on, hopefully, and maybe has some marginal notes in it about some other things. So, Mr. Carter, yours has been sleeted on also. So, okay. But a very valuable work for visiting the battlefield, and then, of course, more recently, he has published a 3-volume look at the campaign leading up to and including the Battle of Chickamauga, as well as a look at the Confederate cavalry in the campaign, and he is now at work on Atlanta campaign subjects too. And Mr. Robert Carter, a now retired music educator, who is also a volunteer at the National Military Park. Robert has taken his interest in the story of the battle here, and provided us with 2 walking tour guides of portions of the battlefield, in particular portions on which one of Bragg's chief subordinates, and that's the only characterization I'll make right now of their relationship, participated, James Longstreet, one that looks at the Confederate breakthrough and the fighting on Snodgrass Hill, and they're a very useful way to get out and see some of the actual ground. So we're glad that we're willing to be here today to talk with us a little bit about Braxton Bragg. And at this point, Dr. Hess, I'll turn it over to you and let you start on.
Thank you, Jim, very much. And I won't take much time for this opening statement because I'm looking forward to your questions and Jim's questions, and have that sort of give and take. That's the fun of it. But just in general, what I wanted to do with the Braxton Bragg biography was to try to get away from the stereotypes that have surrounded and dogged Bragg from his lifetime up to today. And I think I argue in the book we need to stop thinking of Bragg as a cardboard stick figure that we can throw darts at all the time. Because for years and years of going to Civil War roundtables, you mention the name Braxton Bragg, and you can hear titters coming up from the audience. And there's an automatic kind of assumption that he probably did everything wrong and never did anything right. That's unfair for any historical figure. So I really wanted to try to kind of reevaluate Bragg from the ground up and have some fresh perspectives on him and make some arguments that maybe he wasn't so bad after all. Please understand, I'm not arguing he was the next thing to Robert E. Lee or anything like that. We don't need to go to that opposite extreme, but somewhere in between. I think there's a viable perspective of Braxton Bragg, which he's deserving of and which we have a responsibility to try to find and settle on. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted that Dr. Hess wrote his book on Braxton Bragg. My study of Bragg pretty much happened because of this battle of Chickamauga. I was a Chickamauga person first before I was, if I am in any way, a Bragg person or a person interested in Braxton Bragg. Because you can't escape the complexity of the battle. Chickamauga is the Army of Tennessee's only clear-cut battlefield victory of the war. And at the time, it was hailed as a tremendous victory, and then as time dragged on, even just a couple of months later, it's seen as the Confederacy's lost opportunity, or certainly one of them. The Confederacy has plenty of lost opportunities. And almost all of that evolving interpretation of the Battle of Chickamauga has to do with Braxton Bragg. He's an incredibly complex figure and an incredibly interesting figure, I think. Well, we'll leave it there. We'll be, I'm sure we'll have time to readdress that.
Good morning, folks. Thanks for having me here today. My general focus is on one of Bragg's subordinates that was new to the Army of Tennessee, and that's James Longstreet, who probably had more to do than any of his other subordinates with the victory here at Chickamauga with his breakthrough, ever how accidental that was, fought here. Of course, Bragg's other subordinates had been with him for years, leading up to Chickamauga, and Longstreet only arrives the night before, about 11 o'clock, the night of the 19th, and had a brief 1 hour meeting with Bragg. So their command relationship during the battle is what I want to address today. It was a brief one, but of course, as we'll see, Longstreet plays a big part in this battle as it develops from about 11 o'clock on that Sunday morning, September 20th, all the way through the battle. So we'll be talking about that a little bit as well. So keep James Longstreet in your mind as well.
All right. I think we'll just follow on that lead, Robert, and look at that relationship, because as the battle turns out, it is the Confederate success in Longstreet's sector, which is going to give the Confederates the victory on the battlefield, because at least briefly he had some impact on the Army of Tennessee. If I could get each of you all to comment a little bit more about your take on the relationship between Bragg and James Longstreet for the time that Longstreet is indeed one of Bragg's subordinates, both on the days of the battle here and then into the fall of 1863. So, any of you all start off who might want to start more?
Yeah, the relationship between Longstreet and Bragg is something I deal with in the book, and I really think that Bragg probably, even though he doesn't say so, I think that Bragg probably was happy to see Longstreet come, because Bragg had contributed to creating an absolutely poisonous atmosphere within the Army of Tennessee, especially after the Battle of Stones River. And it wasn't just Bragg's fault, it was the fault of Polk and Hardee and other people too, but I think that by the time of Chickamauga, things had gotten so bad inside that military family called the Army of Tennessee that Bragg was having a lot of difficulty putting into execution really good plans of operation that he developed. And I think he was desperate to see fresh blood come into that Army of Tennessee, and Longstreet probably represented that to him. My take, however, on Bragg is that, on Longstreet, is that, of course, as you've mentioned, the breakthrough was not engineered by Longstreet. It happened on the Union side, and Longstreet deserves credit for exploiting it and taking advantage of it and doing what he could about it. But I really slam Longstreet for not cooperating with Bragg as well as he could have during the afternoon and evening of September 20th. He didn't keep Bragg well informed of what was happening on his part of the field. So much so that Bragg didn't even know fully what was going on, didn't even know that that left wing of the Confederate Army had won a sterling victory. And he didn't know the extent to which the Confederates were successful there. Even early on the morning of September 21st, he really didn't know what was going on. That was because Longstreet didn't send him messages. And Longstreet says in his memoirs, I didn't bother to send him a message because I assumed that the cheers of our troops would give him an indication that we were successful. No commander of a field army in the Civil War should have to rely on whether his men are shouting to know what's going on in that part of the field. So I think Longstreet from the very beginning was letting Bragg down. And maybe you guys have a different perspective on it. But I can just say that it got worse after that point.
I tend to view Longstreet a little bit differently. In part because the history of the relationship and the history of the Civil War really tends to see what happens here in September, October, and up through early November 1863 as evolving into a struggle between two men, between Braxton Bragg and James Longstreet. And I view Longstreet as a latecomer to that struggle. The real struggle, as Dr. Hess alluded to, is within the Army of Tennessee. It is an absolutely poisonous atmosphere, to use his phrase. And this is perhaps Bragg's greatest failing, even though he's competent in many things, military strategy, certainly logistics. He's always unable to create a team out of a disparate element or a disparate group of people. Lesser generals, maybe, lesser military men have been able to create greater harmony and then create a force that arguably is better, the whole is better than its parts. That is perhaps Bragg's, certainly that's not Bragg's talent. I think that Longstreet comes here with one huge chip on his shoulder, but it's not necessarily about himself. I think he desperately wants to see his good friend, mentor, a man he admires greatly, Joseph E. Johnson, return to a significant field command. And so he comes here initially somewhat skeptical about Braxton Bragg and hoping to see Joe Johnson return to command. And as it becomes clear that that's not going to happen, their relationship between the two men deteriorates rapidly. That said, for his time on the battlefield, Longstreet is by far the best performer in tactical command of any of Bragg's corps commanders or senior officers. Any of the major or lieutenant generals on the battlefield, Longstreet is able to provide the most coordination and effectiveness. Even though much of what he does is opportunistic, he's still able to achieve a pretty significant result. I'll let you go from there.
Dave made a good point about the struggle being within the command structure of the Army of Tennessee, and that's true. There was sort of a secondary struggle going on too that might surprise some of you, and that was the struggle between James Longstreet and Robert E. Lee, and it was mainly on Longstreet's terms. Longstreet wanted to get out from under Lee's shadow. Longstreet had tremendous ego, and I completely agree with Dr. Hess, what he said. He said, I'm not going to defend Longstreet, and I don't think any of the three of us would, to a large degree, defend him. But Longstreet's own ego, he thought he deserved an Army command. And one of the struggles, too, Dave just mentioned with Joseph E. Johnston being put in command, Longstreet came down here with the idea that this might be his opportunity to get an independent command also. And that was part of it. As a matter of fact, he wrote a letter to Lee on September the 5th before he came down to Georgia. And it's a long letter, but part of this is very surprising if you look at it closely. And it says, if my corps cannot go west, I think we might accomplish something by giving me Jenkins, Wise, and Cook's brigades, and here's the part, and putting me in General Bragg's place and giving him my corps. We could certainly make no great risk in such a change, and we might gain a great deal. I feel that I'm influenced by no personal motive in this suggestion, and will most cheerfully give up when we have a fair prospect of holding our western country. So he's saying, put me in charge of the Army, and when I beat the Yankees, we'll put Bragg back in charge of it. So from the three of us, I hope you can understand, there's a lot of dynamics going on with these top members of this command. You know, Longstreet, as Dave said, would be pleased to have Joseph E. Johnston in command. Looks a little bit askance at Bragg. Longstreet himself sees himself as head of this Army as well. So there's a lot of dynamics that go on here. This move to bring Longstreet down to Georgia was not a new idea. As a matter of fact, Longstreet suggested before the Battle of Chancellorsville that this be done, that the South's greatest hope lay here in the middle, in Middle Tennessee. And before Chancellorsville, this is while General Bragg was still up at Tullahoma. The Confederates had not lost all of Central Tennessee at this time. So he suggested this, and of course Lee's great prestige led the Confederate government to decide on Lee's Pennsylvania campaign, So they overlooked what Longstreet had in store. Which one was right, you just have to be the judge of that, which one was actually the correct move. But history points out that Lee didn't fare well in Pennsylvania. But along with this, Longstreet wanted his own independent command. Now, one final point I want to make before I sit down is, we color Longstreet today by what happened after the Civil War. 11 weeks after Gettysburg, when this battle took place, Longstreet was not damaged by Gettysburg. That happened post-war, as you know, with all the things Jubal Early said, and D.H. Hill, and all the people that criticized Longstreet for various reasons.